All right, welcome everybody. So, this lecture is about consumerism and the crash. I'm going to talk about how what happens to the American economy during the 1920s, how that factors into the crash of the stock market in 1929, which heralded the coming of the Great Depression. So, we're really going to be talking about consumerism. We're going to be talking about the imbalances in the economy that were underneath all of the prosperity of the 1920s, and then how all of this led to the Great Depression. So, we live in a consumer society. Our culture today is very focused, very centered around outward appearances and accumulating the latest devices. How many makeup tutorials or unboxing videos are there on YouTube? All of the ads that we see are targeted to get us to buy things that the advertisers tell us will make our lives better, or at least make them look better to other people. And this is even more true with modern social media, which is all about sharing your latest meal, your latest purchase, your latest trip, and showing the rest of the world how fabulous you look and how awesome your life is. We can find the origins of this culture in the 1920s. Historians have argued that we see a significant shift in the methods of personal self-improvement occurring in the 1920s. And they have used advertisements to illustrate this shift. This shift was from an inner directed focus upon character. I will improve my lot in life by working harder, by being more disciplined, by always doing the right thing, to an outer directed focus on appearance and personality. I will improve my lot in life by being funny, by wearing the right clothes, by being able to talk about the right things. And we can see examples of this in these two ads here. These are just two of the, hundreds of thousands of advertisements that were all over magazines and newspapers during the 1920s. And we start to see a real shift here. First of all, we have this Chrysler ad. What techniques does the Chrysler ad use to appeal to its customers? What kind of customer base are they appealing to here? If we look at the headline in the ad, it says, Chrysler, beauty is no chance creation. And then the rest of the text, or the sort of subheadline is, for the first time in the history of motor car design, an authentic system has been devised based on the canons of ancient classic art. And they provide examples of this, illustrations. So you got to think, well, what are the techniques that they're using here? They're sort of branding Chrysler as this luxury brand, this brand whose design harkens back to ancient artistic forms. And so they're really appealing to an upper middle class or even an upper class consumer here. They are appealing to someone who wants to project sort of wealth and wants to project a sort of refinement that you would see in an art museum, for example. What about the ad for this other product here, which actually happens to be a product called Wheatina, which is a breakfast cereal? What sort of customer base are they appealing to? What are the techniques they're using? If we look at the headline, it says, some wives do it, but I wouldn't dare. And then there's this long story written from the first person perspective of a housewife, how she says, sort of some wives send their husbands out the door in the morning to go to work, and they're hungry and they're, unhappy. But I can't do that with my husband. I feed him a good breakfast. I feed him this product, Wheatina. So we got to think, well, what is the techniques this is using? It's appealing, obviously, to women who are the major consumers in the household. It's appealing to women who are concerned about their relationships with their husbands, right? You don't want to send your husband out the door or, hungry in the morning, because then he's going to not want to come home to you at night. He's, not going to be taken care of in the way that he needs to be taken care of. So that's sort of the implication in this ad. And they're really sort of appealing to this kind of fear of missing out, right? If you're not using this product, Tina, your family is not being cared for in the way that it needs to be cared for. So obviously these are sort of intentional techniques being used by the advertisers here. How are these ads different from what you might see in a magazine today? If we look at advertisements in a magazine today, they're much more visual, right? There's much less text on the screen usually. They are much more, usually the advertisement will be just a photo or a illustration that takes up the whole page rather than just a small part of the advertisement. And I think we want to think about, well, what kind of society is reflected in these ads? What do they tell us about life in America in the 1920s? What are the changes in culture, in social norms, in priorities that we see happening here? When we are trying to figure out what caused something in history, there are usually multiple causes. Very often, people point to the stock market crash of 1929 as the cause of the Great Depression. But what caused the crash? We have to look at the role that consumerism played in causing the Great Depression. And to do that, I want to start off by looking at another ad. The ad here that's in the middle of the screen. What do we see in this ad? How is it promoting the idea of purchasing a car? It's using that fear of missing out thing again. It's using that FOMO technique where you have this family who's walking and they see everybody else in their cars driving, and then someone, either the wife or the daughter maybe, says, everyone owns a car but us. So, again, it's that fear of missing out. And then the ad suggests that you too can own an automobile without missing the money. And now is the time to buy it through the easiest and simplest method ever devised, the Ford Weekly Purchase Plan. So during the 1920s, we see something new in American society. During the 1920s, new credit firms offered consumers the opportunity to pay for goods in installments. Buyers received a loan to make a purchase or an investment, and then they repaid it at a fixed interest rate over time. Buying now and paying later, that became very popular in advertisements during the 1920s, and it encouraged Americans to purchase new consumer goods that they could not previously afford, like a vacuum cleaner or a refrigerator or a washing machine or a car. Before these installment payment plans, only wealthy Americans could afford to pay cash for these kinds of items. Buying on credit now meant that many more Americans could afford these luxury items with a small cash payment and a monthly installment plan. And the resulting increase in demand led to an increase in hiring, an increase in production and buying power, and thus it's a cycle, right? It's a production consumption cycle. The more that people are buying, the more that's being produced, the more jobs there are available in all of the factories producing all of these goods, the more they can buy. At the same time, more and more Americans are going into debt. Some economists believe that by the close of the 1920s, about 60% of cars, about 80% of the furniture, and about 75% of washing machines and radios in Americans' homes had been purchased on these installment plans. So consumer debt is something that we have to keep an eye out for. But that's only part of the issue. What does this other image here, this flyer for a conference of the National Consumers League, what does that suggest about how decisions that were being made at the highest levels of government, including the Supreme Court, how these decisions made in the 1920s are affecting consumers. So this primary source, this flyer, is specifically related to a Supreme Court decision that was given in 1923, the decision in the case of Atkins versus Children's Hospital. In 1918, while the reforming spirit of the progressive era was still at its peak, Congress passed a law to set minimum wages for women and children in the District of Columbia, right? Washington, D.C. is not its own state. Congress sort of controls what happens there. So Congress passes this law to set minimum wages for women and children in the nation's capital. So when Congress passes this law, the Children's Hospital of D.C. And an elevator operator in a hotel brought a case to prevent this act from being enforced by a couple of members of a wage board, including a man named Jesse Atkins. Jesse Atkins, this wage board was responsible for regulating the wages for people in the District of Columbia. And the court ruled in this case of Atkins v. Children's Hospital that passing this law regulating minimum wages was an unconstitutional infringement on the idea of liberty of contract. We've heard about this idea before. I talked about it all the way back when we looked at sort of the industrialization period, the late 19th century. This was an idea that the Supreme Court favored very heavily in the late 19th and early 20th century. During the Gilded Age and even into the Progressive Era, and certainly in the 1920s, the court began to strike down state laws that regulated businesses on the grounds that they were interfering with the right of free laborers to choose their employment and working conditions. So under this reasoning, if a worker didn't like that his employer was requiring him to work 12-hour days or paying him a very low wage, well, that worker can go find another job. But they can't, however, strike or demand that the government regulate his employer and require an 8-hour day or require the employer to pay the worker a higher wage. In this case of Atkins v. Children's Hospital, the court is saying that the federal government doesn't have the power to regulate minimum wages because to the court, the right to buy and sell labor through contract was a liberty protected under the Constitution. So throughout the 1920s, workers' wages were not keeping up with production. And that's what this conference called by the National Consumers League to protest this minimum wage decision by the Supreme Court, that's what they're trying to protest here, right? The National Consumers League is saying this decision affirms your constitutional right to starve. The court is saying here, handing down this decision to this poor woman worker in the District of Columbia and saying basically, no, sorry, your employer, Congress can't set a minimum wage because your employer should be free to pay you whatever they want to. And if you don't like it, well, you can go find another job. So throughout most of the 1920s, workers' wages are just not keeping up with the levels of production. Consumer goods are being produced, and if the wages of the working class had kept pace, things might have been okay, but that didn't happen. Wages were stagnant for the most part. The $5 a day that Henry Ford paid to some of his workers was an anomaly, and it wasn't even all workers at the Ford plant who got that $5 a day wage. It was only a select few. And so the working classes couldn't afford to buy the goods that they were helping to produce. This eventually resulted in way too much supply, not enough demand, so prices start to fall, and the economy starts to fall with it. No one's paying attention to this, though, during the 1920s. The Depression was a huge shock to most Americans who thought that they had been enjoying nearly a decade of unprecedented economic growth. The consumer revolution had fostered this confidence that things are getting better, and they're going to continue to improve. So when the stock market collapses in October of 1929, when factories start to close, when unemployment starts to go up, all of that optimism had been shattered. The seeds of the Depression were planted during the boom of the 1920s. Essentially, a lot of this was because production was growing faster than demand. More and more goods were being produced, and not enough people are there to buy them. No one was farsighted enough, though, to see the warning signs on the horizon. Corporate leaders could have responded when the economy starts to slow down in the late 1920s. They could have raised people's wages. They could have lowered prices. Government officials could have forced people to stop buying things on credit. They could have slowed bank loans. This might have forestalled the worst effects of the Depression. What actually happens? Well, when the economy starts to slow down in the late 1920s, the Federal Reserve Board lowers interest rates, charging banks less for loans in an attempt to stimulate the economy. This additional credit, though, goes into the stock market. It touches off a wave of speculation that ends up obscuring this growing economic slowdown and ensures that it's going to be worse in the future. People with all this extra money now began to invest in the stock market. They were encouraged because stock prices were growing up and up and up. In reality, not that many Americans actually owned stock, but the fact that the market was rising captures the nation's attention and assured Americans that the economy was healthy. It prevented analysis of any underlying flaws here. On October 24th, 1929, stock prices finally started to decline a bit. Investors get nervous. They start to sell. Leading stocks plunged. Some lost nearly half their value in a single day. Speculators start to panic. Prices start to fall even further. Then, on Tuesday, October 29th, a day that becomes known as Black Tuesday, the market crashes. Trading goes so fast that by the end of the day, the ticker recording transactions, back then they actually had a strip of paper that would record transactions in the stock market, that was running 2.5 hours late. And when the final tally could be read, it showed that an extraordinary over 16 million shares had traded hands. The market had lost $14 billion. Within weeks, just the gains of all the previous 2 years had vanished almost overnight. Now, the stock market crash only directly affected about 3 million Americans, but indirectly, it starts to spill over into the larger economy. Once the bottom falls out of the stock market, the economy starts to grind to a halt. Manufacturing output drops to levels lower than they had been in 1913. The production of iron fell to what it had been back in the 1890s. Foreign trade drops by $7 billion. The price of wheat goes from a little over $1 a bushel down to 39 cents. Corn goes from 81 to 33 cents. Cotton falls from 17 cents a pound to just 6 cents a pound. Prices go so low that selling their crops would mean having to take a loss, so struggling farmers simply start to let crops rot in the fields. By 1932, over 1 million people in New York City are unemployed. By 1933, the number of unemployed people across the nation rises to 13 million. That's 1 out of every 4 American workers. The unemployment rate is 25%. People are unable to afford their rent. People can't pay their mortgages. They are becoming homeless. People are just devastated by this. And you can really see that in this illustration here. It sort of is this kind of crude drawing that sort of showing what happens to, kind of emotionally when people, when the stock market crashes. And it labels October 29th, the day of the sort of big crash, dies irae. Dies irae is a Latin phrase that means day of wrath. So it really seems like the end of the world. Wealthy Americans were sure that they knew what had caused the Depression. The problem, they said, was Poor Americans just aren't working hard enough, and they're draining the economy. They have to be forced to take cutbacks. The Treasury Secretary tells the president, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people. This is an actual quote. The Chicago Tribune said, yep, we got to slash government spending. We got to lay off teachers. We got to lay off government workers. We got to demand that those who keep their jobs accept lower wages. Richard Whitney, a former president of the New York Stock Exchange, tells the Senate that the only way to restart the economy is to cut salaries and veterans' benefits. Although he tells them, of course, that his own salary, which at $60,000 was 6 times higher than theirs, was very little and could not be reduced. Others argued that the problem was not the wages of ordinary working Americans being too high, but precisely the opposite. U.S. factories were producing more goods than the American people could consume. And the problem wasn't so much the goods side of things, but that millions of Americans could not afford to buy the goods because the new industrial economy of the 1920s had not distributed wealth broadly enough. Too much money had gone into profits, into dividends, into stock speculation, and not enough had gone into the hands of the workers who, of course, are also consumers, and if they had been paid enough, they could have bought the goods that they were producing. Productivity increased 43% during the 1920s, but wages only went up by 11%. So this is a recipe for disaster. It's important to remember that the Great Depression was not isolated to the United States. It was a worldwide phenomenon, and it speaks to how closely interwoven the U.S. economy was with the global economy, even at this early stage. There were other nations, Canada, for example, that may have been hit harder by the Depression than the U.S. was. The United States throughout the 1920s had been exporting a lot of its agricultural products and its consumer goods to other countries. We were also financing loans to other nations around the world. When the Depression hit, the U.S. and other nations automatically sort of reflexively raise their protective tariffs. That only makes the problem worse because now there's no outlet for the overproduction. No one is trading anything anywhere. World trade contracts, prices fall, governments face financial crisis because the supply of American credit is drying up. Many countries adopted this emergency response to the crisis by raising trade barriers and tariffs, and that further worsens the crisis. As a direct result of the Depression, many nations turned to radical politics. Best example of this, Germany. Germany, after World War I, had been a democratic republic had been created in Germany, the Weimar Republic, but it gets hit very hard by the Depression. They're getting all these loans from America to help rebuild their country and to help pay back all the reparations that they had been sort of hit with after the war. Now those loans are stopped. Unemployment soaring, especially in the big cities, and the political system starts to veer toward extremism. Hitler's Nazi Party comes to power in January of 1933. So an interesting question is raised by this, I think. Why doesn't the U.S. go a similar way? Why do we not turn to extreme political forms to solve the Depression crisis? Well, some people at the time were genuinely afraid that that would happen, that the Depression meant that American capitalism was in danger of collapsing, and it was going to lead to social revolution, maybe communism, maybe fascism. There were American fascist and proto-fascist groups who were kind of on the rise during the 1930s, and all people had to do was just look around them at what was going on in American society during the Depression to find evidence that this might actually happen. Herbert Hoover comes into office as president in March of 1929. In October of 1929, the stock market crashes and the Depression begins. So in some ways, Hoover was just supremely unlucky to be president at the time that this happened. Initially, he tried to keep American spirits up. He kept assuring people, this is just temporary, the economy is going to soon turn around. But as the Depression stretches from weeks into months and then into years, his optimism starts to ring increasingly hollow. Hoover blamed the Depression on foreign causes. He said all these unstable European banks had caused this depression. He had an enormous amount of faith in the American economy. He just could not believe that the Depression was due to inherent flaws in the American economic system. He rejected proposals for bold government action. He instead said private enterprise, charities should cooperate with the government. They can help feed and clothe the needy. He believed that government handouts, direct relief from the American government, that this would undermine Americans' character. The problem was that private businesses, private charities were just simply not capable of coping with the magnitude of this economic crisis, especially because they're being hit themselves. No one has any money to donate to charities. No one has any money to employ the millions of people who are out of work. Eventually, as things become worse and worse and worse, Hoover begins to move beyond just voluntary cooperation to taking some more sweeping government measures. He creates a new federal farm board to loan money to farmers' cooperatives and buy up some of the surplus crops in an effort to raise prices. Congress cuts taxes. They do start to adopt a few federal works projects like the Hoover Dam. He proposes in 1932 an organization that he calls the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is basically a bank bailout. It loans money to financial institutions to try to save them from bankruptcy. But Hoover was still very much opposed to the government giving direct relief or employing thousands of people through massive public works projects. By 1932, Hoover's efforts had clearly not been sufficient, and he was wildly unpopular. Homeless encampments like this one here that you can see in the picture that had sprung up across the country were nicknamed Hoovervilles. These settlements were often formed in desolate areas in a city or, sort of a vacant lot somewhere. And they consisted of hundreds or, dozens, maybe hundreds of shacks and tents that were temporary residences for people who had been unemployed and homeless by the Depression. People were sleeping in cardboard boxes or just directly on the ground. They built these little shacks, creating almost kind of a shanty town. The authorities didn't officially recognize these Hoovervilles. Occasionally, they would send the police in to kind of round up these people and kind of try to move them out. But they were frequently tolerated just because there was nowhere else for people to go. And they used Hoover's name because people are frustrated. People are disappointed with his involvement or his lack of involvement in the relief effort for the Depression. Hoover did not want to give direct aid to the unemployed, and so he gets perceived as being indifferent to human suffering of the Depression. So the vast number of Americans out of work presented a very real threat to the stability of the nation. How are all these individuals going to respond? They had lost their jobs, in many cases lost their homes, they are starving, their children are starving, and the psychological effects of the Depression were very, very real. The hardship of the Depression affected all social classes and all areas of the country. For poor people, the Depression was not necessarily worse than the conditions that they had experienced before, and people who had been poor before the Depression maybe knew how to survive in poverty better than other Americans did. But the middle class, which had always been living throughout the 1920s with these very high expectations, gets hit very hard. People found it very difficult to ask for charity. Some committed suicide rather than have to, sort of look for help. Many people face losing their homes. Many Americans moved to try to escape their immediate hardship. So there are, sort of lines of people along the highways trying to, sort of get somewhere where there might be jobs. Unemployed people are standing in hours in lines for waiting for food or for relief checks or trying to see if any jobs are available. It was a really, really dark time. Some Americans decided that they wanted to petition their government directly for help. The Bonus Army, or the Bonus Expeditionary Force, was a group of about 30,000 World War I veterans, accompanied by their families and by other affiliated groups, who came to Washington, D.C. in the spring and summer of 1932. They were seeking an immediate payment of these service certificates that had been granted to them by Congress back in 1924. These were very similar to bonds that they had been given, and they were set to mature 20 years from the date of their original issue. So under the existing law that had been passed by Congress to give these service certificates to the World War I veterans, they could not be redeemed until 1945. But many of these veterans were now homeless, unemployed. They had no money. They couldn't feed their families. And so they were like, well, I served my country during the war. I went to France, and during that time when I was over there, I lost all of this money that I could have been earning in wages. So now my government needs to pay me back. The Bonus Army massed at the U.S. Capitol in June as the U.S. Senate was voting for a bill that would have moved forward the date when they could get their bonus. Many of them were camping in Hooverville, and the protesters were hoping that they could convince Congress to make these payments that had been granted to the veterans immediately, and that would have provided relief for many of these men who were unemployed due to the Depression. The bill had passed successfully through the House of Representatives, but it gets blocked in the Senate. And when it gets defeated by Congress and some of the protesters refuse to leave, they start to crack down. Washington police tried to remove some of the remaining Bonus Army protesters from a construction site that they were occupying. After the police fatally shot two of the veterans, the protesters fought back. They sort of assaulted the police. After the police retreated, the commissioners of the District of Columbia came to President Hoover and they said, well, we can no longer maintain the peace in the Capitol. And so Hoover sends out federal troops to remove the marchers from the general area. So he sends these troops carrying rifles with unsheathed bayonets and tear gas get sent into the Bonus Army camps. President Hoover doesn't want the army to march into the largest encampment, but the leader of the army, General Douglas MacArthur, he is convinced that this is a communist attempt to overthrow the government. And so he takes matters into his own hands. He sends the troops in. Hundreds of veterans are injured. Several are killed. The army burns down the Bonus Army's tents and shacks. This is all being sort of filmed and broadcast in newsreels across the country, reports of U.S. soldiers marching against World War I veterans. This is not helpful to Hoover's reelection campaign. And his open opposition to the bonus bill really sort of ends up being a kind of a PR disaster for him. Hoover's opponent in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, he doesn't want to have to pay the bonus either, but he handles the veterans with a lot more skill when they again march on Washington the following year. He sends his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, out to talk with the veterans and help them, and she persuades many of them to sign up for the new government jobs that FDR has instituted. I'm going to play for you now a short little video. This is a newsreel of the troops and the tanks and the tear gas being used to evict these World War I veterans in Washington. Here you can see the police going into the construction site to try to remove the protesters from there. Some of them are going willingly, as you can see here. Some are not so are being escorted out. Some are going not willingly. Some were sort of carried out forcibly. And this is a shot here of the cavalry going down Pennsylvania Avenue, heading out to sort of evict the protesters. This is you can see the Hooverville here being burned down, and the smoke from this sort of drifts across the lawn of the White House, which is, sort of pretty striking image there. There's the U.S. Capitol. So you can see how close this really was. The police are trying to kind of move the protesters out, round people up, arrest people. And you can see they're sort of moving people off to the side here. Here we have the cavalry coming down the street, being sent in to enforce the, sort of removal. And here we've got some tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue. Here's the troops going out to try to evict the veterans. So it really was a pretty shameful episode in American history. So FDR became the nation's choice to replace Herbert Hoover as president in 1932. And I want to talk about him for a little bit, just because it's important to understand who he was in order to understand what we're going to talk about next week, which is the New Deal. So FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was born in 1882 in upstate New York. His father and his mother were both from very wealthy old New York families. Franklin was their only child, so he is born into this atmosphere of extreme wealth and privilege. While he was in college at Harvard, his distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, becomes president. And Teddy Roosevelt's very vigorous leadership style and his reforming impulses really made him into Franklin's role model and hero. He went to law school after he graduated college. He goes to law school in 1905. He never actually graduates from law school because in 1907 he passes the New York State bar exam, and so he actually sort of becomes a lawyer without ever actually having graduated law school. In 1908, he takes a job with a prestigious Wall Street law firm. And fairly quickly soon after that, he starts to get into politics. In 1910, he runs for the New York State Senate. He wins his race. He becomes a progressive leader in the state of New York. And in 1913, he gets an appointment to the federal government. He becomes the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson in 1913. In August of 1921, while he was on vacation in the South, Roosevelt contracted an illness. It was believed to be polio, and it resulted in him becoming totally and completely paralyzed from the waist down. Now, of course, this is a time in which the private lives of public figures were not subject to the same kind of scrutiny that they are today. And so he was able to convince many people that he was in fact getting better. And he believed that that was essential if he were ever able to run for public office again. So he sort of taught himself, he wore these braces, he taught himself to sort of walk for short distances. In private, he used a wheelchair, but he was very careful never to be seen in it in public. That's why there are very few photographs of FDR in his wheelchair. He usually appeared in public standing upright behind a podium or maybe supported by one of his aides. He gets back into politics after he recovers a bit. He's elected the governor of New York in 1928. He comes into office as a reforming Democrat. And he starts to establish a number of new social programs and begins gathering a team of advisors that he's going to bring with him to Washington 4 years later. He was a very talented and persuasive politician. He was very good at being able to convince people of his convictions. He was extremely charismatic, very outgoing, very optimistic. He could kind of project this air of optimism that is going to serve him really well when he's sort of trying to guide the nation through the Great Depression. And he's especially effective at using the media of his time, particularly radio. So he has this really strong base in the nation's most populated state. That makes him the obvious candidate to be the Democratic nominee in 1932. This election was pretty hotly contested. It seemed like the incumbent, Herbert Hoover, was going to be very vulnerable in the 1932 election. So Roosevelt and the Democratic Party that year are able to mobilize a coalition. They're able to mobilize the votes of the poor, who, of course, there are a lot more poor people in the country in 1932. They're able to mobilize the working class, organized labor, people of color get on board and start supporting Roosevelt, people living in the cities, urban Americans, and the kind of traditional coalition of the Democratic Party at that time were still Southern whites. That was sort of the base of the party. This is what becomes known as the New Deal coalition. During the campaign, Roosevelt said, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. And that's the slogan that sort of gets adopted later for his legislative program, as well as this new coalition of voters that he puts together. As you can see from the map here, the election in 1932 is a complete landslide in favor of the Democratic candidate, FDR. Hoover is overwhelmingly defeated both in the popular vote and in the Electoral College. Hoover tried to argue against FDR's vision, and he was definitely right when he said during the campaign that it was more than a contest between two men or between two parties. He said it is a contest between two philosophies of government. Hoover argued that the program that FDR was proposing, all of this sort of government relief that he was promising the American people, that was the wrong approach. He said, sort of we can't, kind of allow our system to be upended like this. We need to, sort of get things back to normal and to, this New Deal, this is going to destroy our American system. The country, however, was ready to embrace the idea of the government making a new deal with its citizens, and that's exactly what FDR promised. And as we're going to see next week, that's what he delivered. He really, when he comes into office, really ends up transforming the American government in some pretty significant ways. So we're going to explore that a bit more next week. All right, take care, everybody.